Welcome back to the Accidental Farmer Podcast, the podcast that gives you the real dirt on farming. Today's episode is a special one. We're talking about milk, something so everyday, yet so full of cultural, historical, political, and ecological meaning. I'm joined by two fantastic guests and who are remarkable thinkers, and I will introduce them. I have Dr. J.C. Niala, who is an anthropologist and a historian, and she's the head of research, teaching, and collections at the History of Science Museum at the University of Oxford. And I also have Dr. Johanna Zetterstrom Sharp, who's an associate professor in heritage and museum studies at University College London. Together, they have co-authored The Politics of Milk and host the brilliant podcast Milk on the Move. And we'll be making reference to one episode that I really enjoyed called Purity and Danger, which digs into the microbial, moral, and cultural tensions inside milk. Let's get into it. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. So I'll ask a question that both of you can answer, but I'll start with you, Dr. JC. What first drew you to studying milk? Why does this everyday drink carry so much meaning?
Well, I think in Kenya, when I was growing up, what was really fascinating was that we have parallel systems of milk. There's traditional pastoralist systems. We grew up with a cow at home who we used to go and milk. But then there's also KCC creameries, which is an industrial milk system. So there were many different kinds of milk, all in coexistence at the same time. And that really fascinated me, thinking about why do people drink the milk that they drink? Why does milk carry so much weight? I'll even mention very briefly Morsik, which our Kenyan runners argue that that's the reason that they're so fast is because of drinking this fermented milk.
Yeah. How about you?
My mother's Swedish, so I grew up drinking a lot of milk. We had milk for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So it was almost like water in that we expected to have it every day. You'd open the fridge, you'd take out a big 3 liter carton of milk and pour it and drink it. And sometimes it would go off and you'd pour it down the sink. So it was this disposable milk. When I grew up there, my grandfather had a farm and we used to get raw milk there. So we'd go down the lane and we'd have this beautiful, sweet raw milk. But unfortunately, the farm closed about 10 years ago. And when I was speaking to the dairy farmers, they were explaining that the reason that they had to close was because they couldn't keep up with the industrial model that they were forced to engage with. So they were a small farm, a small organic farm with a small herd of cows, but the expectations on them in relation to volume wasn't something that they could sustain, and it was impacting the health of the cows. And I suddenly started thinking these two things, they sit in tension, right? This idea of disposable milk that you can drink, it's like water from a tap, and then the impact on land, the impact on farmers, and the impact on cows. And the way those two sit together in tension is something that I find fascinating, worrying, but also I just want to understand more.
Oh, interesting. Okay. JC, your research asks, what is hidden in a glass of milk? So what ecological, cultural, and historical stories sit inside that drink?
So I'll bounce off what Johanna was saying. When you open the fridge and you take out a glass of milk, people still have in their imagination. And especially in a country like Kenya, where many of us are used to seeing cows wandering around, people still think, oh, I know the cow that this milk is coming from. But actually, and most people, especially if you live in the urban areas, what is that? That's not the milk of one cow. It is the milk of hundreds or thousands of cows that has been amalgamated together, has been processed, and has been delivered to you. So that's one of the things that is hidden, is just the volume of cows that it goes into producing one glass of milk. The other thing that's hidden in the industrial process when we talk about numbers is each cow is now producing more liters of milk than it ever has before. The productivity has gone up, and with productivity going up, the high yield, it means that the cost can come down. So as Johanna was saying, if the milk goes off, you just throw it away and you go and you buy more milk. And with that, herds are also getting bigger in terms of the dairies in an industrial process. So you end up with places like the US where you can find a dairy farm that has 18,000 cattle. in one situation. So it's very different how you treat the animal, how you manage the land when you're going from 1 to 10 to 1,000 to 18,000. So all of these things are hidden. And they're particularly hidden because if you look at packaging for milk, the packaging won't show you 18,000 cows in a barn. It will show you that one cow. In the UK, that cow tends to be called Daisy. You imagine the black and
Yes,
white
yes,
cow
yes.
in the field with the buttercups.
Mm.
In Kenya, that cow tends to be called Blessing. And in the US, it tends to be called Bessie.
Yeah.
So there's always this image of the singular cow.
Yeah.
The other thing that you also don't see is that cows are mothers. You'll never see a picture on a bottle of milk that's being sold or a Tetra Pak of milk of the cow with the calf. You will only ever just see the cow. So the motherhood of the cow is hidden. And yet, if we see pastoralist peoples, if we see Maasai people, very often the calf is there. If you see how they milk, the calf is drinking from one teat and the family is milking from the other.
Okay. And why do you think that is the case?
Why is it
Yeah,
hidden?
yeah.
I think it's hidden because I think if you start to think about the fact, if you start to ask all sorts of ethical questions about where is the calf? Why has it been separated from the mother? And I'm saying this now with no judgment to any kind of milk that people drink. But when you start to ask those questions, you might come up with answers that make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. And so because of that, the image is sold, a pastoralist image, an image that brings a lot of nostalgia for childhood, that instead of the realities of what an industrial plant of 18,000 cows would look like.
Okay.
Yeah.
Johanna, from your heritage and power lens, why is milk such a powerful entry into identity, morality, and social change?
Oh, for so many reasons. I think milk is a substance that we all know, that we all have a very particular understanding of because it's very familiar. Our first food is milk.
Yes.
Growing up, depending on where you are in the world, but a lot of people drink milk at childhood, in the home. And so that familiarity is a way into understanding, to bring people into a conversation about how a substance that has become such a global commodity is understood in many different ways. And I think there is something I was just thinking about what JC was talking about in relation to the way that what's hidden in a glass of milk. And one of the things that's hidden is the intimacy of milk. So it is the global dairy industry is very much constructed around milk as a homogeneous flat substance, a white drink that you take out of the fridge. But of course, milk is breast milk, which is something that the industry that consumers struggle to engage with when they don't see the cow, live with the cow, where the milk comes from. Milk is alive, it's full of microbes, so it shifts and changes, and all of the regulation that's needed in order to control that aliveness is one of the things that is a kind of a key vector of power in relation to the regulation of farmers, the regulation of the dairy industry. Milk is also a very interesting lens for looking at the control of land. One of the things that we're looking at in our project a little bit is the colonial history of milk, and in Kenya that falls out in a particular way. But for example, in North America, in the Pacific, the enclosure of land was absolutely central to occupation, and that enclosure was about creating space for cows to graze. So it has all of these ways into thinking about land, thinking about health, and thinking about how we as how we culturally create and control and constrain a substance that is intimate, that is alive, that is it's very interesting.
Yeah. JC, you said that Kenya is unusual because we have these pastoral systems, the informal sector,
Yes.
and the industrial processes all
Yes.
coexisting.
Yes.
So, what makes this combination so fascinating from an ecological and social perspective?
So let's even start off with the animals. Kenya has 3 types of milk that people drink. They drink goat milk, they drink cow milk, and they also drink camel milk. So already those are milks that have very different qualities. They say that goat milk is the closest to human milk. Camel milk is a lot richer. And there's some people, particularly in parts of Eastleigh and Nairobi, that will argue that they can tell you exactly which camel herd in northern Kenya that particular milk has come from.
Okay.
So there's very strong feelings around, first of all, the animal milk that you're drinking. and then the systems in which they live in. I would say that camels still have the largest grazing land, particularly in northern Kenya. They still roam a lot further. People, in fact, I remember having a conversation with Johanna about this because camels are starting to go through the industrial milk process now. And they're starting to, especially in places like Saudi Arabia, they're starting to have these bigger and bigger dairy farms. And I was saying to Johanna, but how can they do that? Because camels need to wander a lot. And Johanna was like, yeah, but even cows used to also wander.
Okay.
And Kenya shows us this because it's always very interesting when there's on social media, people are complaining, oh, but I'm there on Gong Road and there's
Yeah,
100
cows.
head of
Yeah,
cattle.
yeah.
And that's because cattle also graze and they also need large areas of land. And in terms of the grazing, if we go back to the colonial context, yesterday, I was reading the Hansards, the parliamentary records from the British colonial government in the 1900s. And they were talking about two areas in particular in Ukambani and in Laikipia. And they were discussing the difference in the way the grazing lands are being used and the ecological fallout of that. In Laikipia, Samburu peoples move over very large areas, which means that there's a fragile but a much more resilient ecological balance because cows are not being locked in one area and overgrazing. But then what happened in Ukambani, particularly in the colonial times, is their grazing areas were restricted. And actually, there was a massive drop in stock when people were denied access to grazing land. So suddenly you have cows that could travel for kilometers that were in a much smaller space, and overgrazing began to happen.
Okay. Johanna, what imaginaries? I didn't know what imaginaries were. The way people imagine milk flows through society shape how Kenyans and policymakers think about milk today.
That's a very good question. Yeah, so we think about imaginaries because it helps us think about the idea of milk as something that is culturally created. So milk is a substance that comes from a cow, but it's also something that has all these cultural values and political values and economic values tied to it. One of the things that's been very interesting is reading about trust as one of the key mechanisms through which people decide where to get their milk from. There was a really interesting study that came out of Nairobi that was looking at how whether you drink raw milk and you buy it from direct from supplier or whether you buy supermarket milk, the thing that's really leading people in relation to the decisions they're making is trust. And trust is such an interesting thing when it comes to milk because it's trusting the health of the cow, it's trusting that the milk is going to be safe to drink. And the way that people think about and understand trust is, of course, dependent on their relationship to the milk that they're getting. So when you know the farmer, when you can see the cow, you can trust that that milk is fresh, that it's clean, that it's healthy. When you don't, when the cow moves out of the city, then you need other mechanisms of trust, and that's where regulation comes in, and it's where packaging comes in. So one of the sort of the key shifts in Northern Europe has been that regulation has controlled the dairy industry. So people look to a stamp that says this is certified milk to say, okay, I can't see the cow, but I can trust the regulator and I know that this milk is safe. But what's very interesting in Kenya is actually there's much more creativity in the way that people are thinking about and understanding trust. So yes, there's regulation and there is a particular history to that regulation, but there's also people realizing and understanding and having relationships with the farmer. So in terms of an imaginary, I think that way that trust plays out around milk is very different. And looking at the UK and Kenya helps us understand how, milk isn't one thing, but it's very much dependent on the place in which it's made and consumed.
And I think it's also interesting to add, when we look at UK and Kenya, is yes, there's still cows in Nairobi, but there were cows in London. There used to be dairies in London until relatively recently. In fact, the last dairy only closed in 1983, and there were hundreds of dairies, and you can still see it in the architecture. So if in certain parts of central London where you have these very expensive mews houses, those were actually the stables where the cows were living. So yeah, it left a major imprint on the architecture of London, and it was a similar pattern. People used to know the cows, they knew the farmers. Milk was delivered fresh 3 times a day, and that's a history that has been forgotten. But it was very similar mechanisms were going on around the trust and the introduction of regulation.
Okay. So where do the imaginaries of how Kenya's milk system should work clash with what actually happens on the ground? Especially when it comes to the infrastructure like centralized processing, road networks, and everyday practices.
Yeah, so this is one of the major challenges, and I think Johanna will talk a little bit more about the case study of Mariakani. But if we think about the fact is that milk is safest when it's in the cow or the camel.
Yes.
So the minute it leaves the udder, there's the question of its aliveness and the microbials, and then how do you handle it? So traditionally in Kenya, this is why maziwa mala, mersik, all these, we ferment the milk, which helps to keep it safe. But if you're taking it to a central processing, then that's when infrastructure comes in very quickly. So in order for the economies of scale to work, it makes sense to have one plant that you build somewhere and then get all the farmers in the area to deliver it to that area. But often a lot of the assumptions are built on the fact that all the roads fine to
Are
use,
accessible.
accessible, the different vehicles being used to pick up are roadworthy, they won't break down. So you can start off in a situation where there's a farmer who thinks, okay, great, I'll send my milk over, but then by the time it reaches the processing plant, it has spoiled because maybe the van broke down,
handling,
the road,
logistics.
all of these, the logistics failed that situation. And then coming back to what Johanna was saying about trust, the farmer's thinking, hang on, am I being told why am I really being told my milk is bad? See, I followed all the rules. I did everything correctly. But, and I'll let Johanna talk about Mariakani more and what happens when infrastructure fails.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Expand on that. I'll tell you why I'm interested.
Yeah.
I like what you said, that the milk is safest when it's in the cow, right? Yeah. But even that is not a guarantee because of what the cow could have consumed.
Yes, that's true.
I don't know if I'm
that's
making
true.
sense.
Yeah, you are making
because
sense.
there's a big problem in where I am. I'm not a dairy farmer, but I'm an organic farmer, and that's a big thing we're saying is that what are we consuming?
Yes.
The foods and the spraying. Okay, let me explain it a bit differently. There's a big concern about the honey that we're producing, the bees, because in the pollination, what we're spraying on our flowers and on our on what the bees use to make the honey is contaminated, and there's so I don't know about, is that the same with cows?
It is very much so. So before Johanna goes into Mariakani, I'll talk a little bit about calcium because that's the easiest way to trace it with cows. So and it was very interesting. So Johanna and I were at the FAO archives in Rome in September, and we were looking at various reports that came out of different parts of Kenya. One was from Meru, and it was really interesting. These researchers were going, hang on, how come there's all these children in Meru who have very good calcium levels, but they don't drink much milk? But the reason being is they were actually getting the calcium from dark green leafy vegetables because the calcium actually comes from the soil. So if you have a soil that's rich in calcium, you get the dark green leafies, you'll have good calcium. And also the calcium is much more bioavailable or readily absorbable. Right. So what happens now with the calcium in milk? Because when we were growing up, everybody says drink milk to get calcium. But the calcium is traveling. It's going from the soil into the grass, into the cow before it gets to you, right? So the challenge becomes when you go from a cow that might be in your back garden that's eating that grass and then you get the milk immediately, you'll get the calcium. But when cows, you start to get bigger dairies and hundreds, and they're moving into barns. They don't have access to that calcium-rich grass anymore. So the milk that they're producing has less calcium. So what happens is it has to be fortified now. You actually have to add the calcium to the milk as part of the processing in order for people to get it. So it's very similar to the question of the bees. So you're right. When I was talking about safety, I was thinking about safety in terms of the microbes.
I understand.
But actually in terms of nutritional quality, it very much depends on what the cow is eating.
And contaminants from
Eggs.
Exactly. Okay.
Exactly.
That's interesting. So tell us a little bit about Mariakani and this whole infrastructure and centralizing, because that was what the whole idea was behind that project, if I'm not wrong.
So this was something we were reading about in Rome at the Food and Agricultural Organization archives. And Mariakani was really the blueprint for this centralization of milk collection and processing. It was Mariakani was established to supply Mombasa with fresh milk. And what happened when settlers left, because most of the milk that was supplying Mombasa was actually coming from European dairies, and when the settlers left, there was a lack of milk supplying Mombasa.
Okay.
And so Mariakani was already established. It was a central processing plant,
Okay.
and it was really about pasteurizing milk. So as JC explained, it was about collecting milk from small dairies, bringing them into a central processing plant, and processing it. But what happened towards the sort of the mid to late 50s was that they needed to expand Mariakani, so they bought even more equipment, equipment produced in Birmingham, in order to process milk in large volumes. And so they were collecting milk from small dairies in quite a large region, around 70 kilometers surrounding Mariakani. And it's really interesting reading the archives, because there is this real problem of how do you collect the milk going down these roads. There are so many different collecting points. The trucks are breaking down, the milk's spoiling. And so they started reducing the collecting points so they could make fewer collections. But what's kind of underlying this, going back to trust, is an enormous mistrust from the experts that are coming to advise Mariakani. So a lot of them are coming from Britain, but also from New Zealand, and they're coming to sort of say, okay, this is how we operate and how we build this processing plant. There's a huge amount of mistrust of the dairy producers. So there's a mistrust that the dairy producers don't understand the health of their cow. They don't understand the importance of what the cow's eating in relation to the quality of the milk. There's huge mistrust in the drivers of the trucks that are picking it up, that those drivers are wasting time, which is why the milk is spoiling, when actually it's the infrastructure that's not working. And there's mistrust in the sort of the drivers and the people collecting milk are taking a cut, or they're watering down the milk. And so then you get this pivot towards further regulation. So you have regulators sitting on the trucks, so when the milk's collected, they can verify that the milk's of good quality. That determines the price that the farmers are paying. And the thing that is not understood is that actually this is a system that was operating fine. People had cows, they were selling their milk, they were processing their own milk safely. But because of the mistrust, because these European and experts were not able to see those cows, they were not able to see the process. They thought, okay, we need to have oversight. So you end up with this form of regulation that comes about control. And I just want to say one other thing about regulation, because it's not all bad. Regulation's important, and particularly when it comes to safety. But the regulators are trained in industrial dairying. So the way that they understand the milk system is in relation to large volumes of cows, where things like mastitis, as you'll know, is really important to monitor, where the health of the cow is in constant flux, because you have new cows coming in, you have introductions of new breeds, and this creates lots of problems which you can manage, but these aren't the problems that small scale dairy farmers are dealing with. And so this regulation comes, and it actually makes it very hard for small scale dairies to operate, because they're being managed through a system that was never set up to support them in the first place. And Mariakani is a really good example of that. It's the blueprint, and it's kind of what the model that then gets exported to the management and regulation of other cooperatives, central dairies in Kenya, and also across southern and East Africa.
Interesting. I heard there was an attempt to revive the whole Mariakani project. It'll be interesting to read about it and find out what has happened since, because this was in the 50s, yeah?
Yes, this was in the 50s.
Yeah.
50s,
Yeah.
Which is good. You bring up regulation, which is what I want us to talk a little bit about next. So for years, the dominant narrative has been that Kenya's milk sector is 70 to 80% informal. But the new Kenya Dairy Board data, it's called the new Kenya Dairy Board, same as the old Kenya Dairy Board, tells a very different story. It says that Kenya is now roughly 60% formal, 40% informal.
Interesting.
Even rural areas are more formal than previously believed. And the Kenya Dairy Board currently has 2,450 licensed operators. And the industry is growing at about 5% per year. And, according to this report, it says that youth get free licensing and co-pasteurization support. And that Kenya apparently has one of the most advanced dairy systems in Africa. So what does this shift from the old informality narrative to new evidence of widespread formalization tell us about the danger of single stories in food systems. Yeah.
What it does, yes, Kenya really does have one of the
Yeah.
most advanced dairy systems on
On
the
the continent.
continent.
Yeah.
But what that data is capturing, it captures a really good picture, but it is capturing a particular picture.
Yeah.
There's a photograph, which maybe I'll give you to share on the website,
Please.
which is of a Maasai family in Kuinda here in Nairobi, who are milking their cows with the cow with calf method. And behind the mother who is milking the cow is a kiosk. And there's an advert on the kiosk for Tuzo milk.
Okay.
And to me, that really symbolizes Kenya, because there you have in the foreground a traditional system that is not necessarily captured by this kind of data,
Yeah.
but also very real and very present is an advert for exactly the kind of milk that is talked about in this data.
Okay.
So I really do think what would be great to see is data that is actually much more plural.
Yes.
There is, the Kenya, the industrial dairy system in Kenya is advancing. It's, the youth inclusion is really happening. All of that is very real. But what fascinates me is it still hasn't changed the traditional systems
Yeah.
that carry on side by side, because that, as I said, that photograph shows you it's happening in the same place
Yes.
at the same time.
Okay. You like to make it?
There's it was just reminding me there's a really interesting piece of research that's looking at dairy farmers in the US in the 1920s.
Okay.
So one of the key identified risks in milk at the time was tuberculosis, and so you had these tuberculin testers that were going to farms to test the health of the herd. If one cow was seen to have tuberculosis, the whole herd would be killed.
Yeah.
And so farmers were resisting, and the way that they were resisting was that they were hiding their cows,
Yeah.
and so that farmers have an enormous amount of agency in relation to how they're counted and how they're recorded. And for things like the formalization of the sector, that has advantages, but it also has risks. And so as a dairy farmer, to sort of not necessarily hide, but to resist by not being counted is a way of holding your autonomy. So figures like that are really interesting, and it's really interesting to see the shift, but they don't, as JC said, tell the full.
And also that let's remember the crossover. So this particular family who I was spending time with, when I was asking about the health of the cows, the father in this family immediately said, "I can show you all of the times where my cows are vaccinated. This is the vet." And these are the same vets and the same vaccines that are also present in the industrial system. So there's also a syncretism that goes on. So it's not really a case of one or the other. It's this mosaic landscape, which is really, really fascinating.
Yeah. Which then I would ask, how do power structures and historical categories influence then what gets labeled informal or formal? And why do these labels persist even when the data keeps changing? I guess that's
Yeah, that's a really interesting question.
yeah.
I mean, I think this sort of the formalization of the dairy industry is. I mean, I keep going back to trust, but it's such an important thing. Is that the certification of trust? So it at a point where milk is transitioning from your backyard, where you can see the cow and you can trust the farmer, and it's transitioning to you're getting your milk from a farm that might be several miles away, or in a different state, a different continent. There's a huge global uh, circulation of dairy. So when you don't see where your milk comes from, then the certification of the formal structures become very important. And there's an enormous amount of power in that, because as soon as you have regulators that come in to give you a certificate, those regulators are making decisions around what good hygiene practice looks like, what the relationship between the cow and the calf is, how your milk is collected and what time, and then when it's processed and when it's picked up. One of the biggest costs, when we've been speaking to farmers, one of the biggest costs that they face is from milk collection. So in order to survive, farmers have to produce many farmers have to produce large volumes.
Yeah.
That milk has to be collected,
Yeah.
and every collection costs. So they're encouraged to produce even more
Yeah.
volume. But in order to produce volume, you need this certification. So you need this formalization. So all of these things go hand in hand. Trust, economics, decision making, and it's a very messy, knotty system that's built around this high yield, low cost model that we talked about at the beginning,
Yes.
and which isn't challenged. This idea of disposable fridge milk, which is in itself, when you think about what milk is, it's produced by mothers for their calves. It's quite a disturbing way of thinking about something which is really intimate and very quite sacred in many ways.
Yeah. And I see the whole thing about regulation as well. We see it again in horticulture.
Yeah,
Yes.
And of course, the thing with regulation is that, whereas, as you said earlier, that it's necessary, regulation unfortunately tends to lead to over-regulation. And so once something is introduced, then many other things get introduced.
Yes.
And and then the cost it's always passed on to the producer.
Yes, and it also causes problems.
It does.
Regulation
It
in one
becomes
way creates
hurdles
problems
in
somewhere
another.
else that then need
Exactly.
regulation.
Yes.
Exactly. Then you need it.
It
Exactly.
is, yeah.
And in terms of the cost, what certification today costs X amount of shillings.
Yes.
Tomorrow, because it's the revenue to the
Yes.
it keeps rising. So it's a delicate thing.
Yeah. It's.
And then from your fieldwork, JC, and ecological perspective, this 60-40 picture, you've kind of alluded to it. Does it align more closely with what you see on the ground? Is it really 60% formal, 40% informal, or are these things that we want to hear?
As I need to really sit and understand a lot more where how these figures came about. I think sometimes what is also missing is actually what happens at the level of the household. So you can have a household that says, yes, we go to the supermarket and we buy our milk every week. But then that household won't necessarily tell you that when auntie comes to visit over the weekend, she's also brought milk from home that you're also consuming. So there's a much more subtle and a much more complex picture. And again, coming back to those categories, what do people see as formal or informal? If I speak about the Maasai father who I spoke with, he actually feels he's engaging with a formal system because his cows are treated by government vets, because they follow government vaccination programs. So he would say he's very much a part of the formal system. But on the other hand, he's practicing cow with calf, which are traditional systems. Which category does that sit in?
It's. So then it begs the question: these statistics, what are they really showing?
It's not an easy system to pass and say this is one thing here and this is something else here, especially with the way people live on the ground. Yeah.
Very good. So I'll go back to the Mariakani Milk Project and also the Kisumu Municipal Dairies. I want to talk a little bit. What do these histories reveal about the roots of today's dairy challenges and the visions of modern dairying that still shape the system today? So these projects that were brought in to kind of address, I guess it was to scale, really, or to industrialize.
And how do they shape modern dairy systems?
Yeah. And what do they reveal about the roots of the challenges that we're facing?
Yeah.
What are the real challenges, and are they addressing them?
I think there's something about expertise. So who holds expertise and who's trusted to have expertise? So both Kasumi and Mariakani were heavily influenced by experts that would come. They would stay 3 months, and they would shape the processing. They would draw advice on how to collect milk and the policies. And the dairy industry is one of those global industries that has always been shaped by a particular kind of expertise that comes from I guess the fact that milk can be dangerous, that it is intimate, that it needs this kind of this control, and so I think that the way that we think about expertise and who has it and how that continues to shape regulation, who is brought in to provide scientific advice in a context that they don't actually understand from a cultural perspective, I think is one thing that we're still contending with. And then I think this, this scale is just is these centralized processing plants, whether in Kenya or the UK in Kisumu and Mayakani or elsewhere, were all about were all about control in order to scale up. So how can we ensure that we can observe the practices that are happening in small dairies around, bring that milk in, and then ultimately control that milk, control what happens to it after it leaves the cow, the volume of it, and how it's distributed.
And I think, let's remember the realities on the ground. So in the UK, in the last 20 years, there have been hundreds of small dairies that have closed. There's also similar situations happening in Kenya. And that's because of the, high yield, low cost. I think these systems that are set up for high scale forget that actually the pressure is then applied on the people who are looking after the animals and the land. And you talked about the increasing costs of regulation and so on. So when you have an imagined system, and you can see it's coming from a very rational place. Urban centers have large numbers of people. We need to get milk in to feed large numbers of people. So it makes sense to have a bigger scale. But what does that mean for the reality? I'll come back to that 18,000 cow dairy in Texas. A fire broke out in it. Within 24 hours, every single last cow died. Because that's what happens when you pack that many cows into a particular dairy to create a system of scale. That's a really shocking moment, but it is in those moments that actually these large scale systems are exposed. The challenges, to come back to your question about what's hidden, the hidden challenges suddenly become very exposed. And so, I mean, a thought experiment that I often think about is what happened if, instead of thinking about large centralized, what if there were micro dairies all around the country that served particular regions? What would that look like if that was something that was proposed and invested in? I'm not necessarily saying that that's the right solution, but we haven't tried that. We don't know. So centralization has given certain benefits, but what needs more discussing is the challenges that it has raised and what happens when you end up in a situation where 18,000 cows can die overnight because of the vulnerabilities of an industrial system.
Wow. So while still on the topic of danger of milk, I'm going to make reference to an episode I listened to yesterday on your podcast, Milk, a brilliant podcast, Milk on the Move. And the episode was Purity and Danger. And in that, you explored the idea that milk is like this. Milk is alive, microbial, dynamic, and unpredictable. So, JC, what does it mean to say milk is alive? And why does that matter for how societies work with milk?
So very much that, milk is full of microbes. And this is a good thing. Because we need good bacteria in order to have good gut health. But this also means that milk, there can be dangerous microbes as well. And so regulation is working towards an idea of a substance that doesn't change. But the substance is always changing. Let's start with mothers. Mother's breast milk responds to the need of the child. So if the child is not doing well, the mother will produce breast milk that would respond to that need. And that's how all milks are. And so you end up in a situation where the regulation is trying to create something safe, but basing it on a system that finds it very hard to handle the fact that milk is always changing. But milk is always changing not just of itself, but two different people can consume exactly the same glass of milk and have different responses based on their own health. Very hard to regulate for.
So how do purity, danger, and morality then shape debates around milk safety, regulation, and standards, Johanna?
Yeah, it's a very nice, it's a good question. I mean, I just was thinking about the aliveness of milk, and of course, it's the aliveness that has, in terms of our deep history and relationship with milk, it's the aliveness that has enabled us to preserve it. So it's the aliveness that means we can make cheese, we can make yogurt, we can make mursik, and it is ultimately about kind of control of that aliveness. And there are moralities tied into that. I'm just thinking back to Kisumu Municipal Dairy, and the ways in which the European experts that were maintaining that dairy were thinking about hygiene, for example, and were concerned with the ways in which traditional ways of processing milk would not produce milk that was safe to drink. And then you see that kind of scaling up in relation to, for example, the global cheese industry and pasteurized cheese versus raw milk cheese.
Okay.
We were talking to cheese producers, and they were talking about the difficulty now of getting hold of milk that is still alive, that is the milk that you need in order to produce good cheese. And there was a really interesting story around a particular strain of bacteria that was created by a Danish scientist in the 1900s in order to be able to make cheese from pasteurized milk. Interestingly, Maria Kani actually had a cheese room. So in this
okay.
model of how to produce the perfect blueprint for a dairy, a cheese room was central to it. But the cheese that they were producing at Maria Kani was this Danish cheese, so you could make cheese from pasteurized milk. So you get this abstraction where the very thing that the aliveness of milk enables you to make, milk safe and preserved and stay for longer, becomes kind of corrupted through this idea that actually raw milk is dirty milk, raw milk is unhygienic milk, pasteurized milk is the way to go. And that's the way that the kind of the global dairy industry is very much angled towards is large scale pasteurized milk.
And then what ends up happening is this morality is then passed on to the farmers, because there's a lot of farmers and cheesemakers who are making all sorts of raw cheeses, milk from raw cheeses. There's the parmesans and so on from Italy. And so now for certain sections in the population, they're put on a pedestal. These people who are making these traditional cheeses, and the farmers are just trying to make the cheese, but then but then they're now being seen as these uphold these heroes of upholding tradition. So they and they didn't choose that pedestal. They're carrying out. So it's fascinating.
And then you also have the raw milk industry, which is something that's growing in the US, and it is a very moralized conversation. Raw milk can be very dangerous, and particularly when you're getting raw milk through a system where you don't know the cow and you don't know the farmer, so you can't trust that milk. So in the US, and it's a very much a sort of there is an inherent kind of goodness to raw milk. It's better than pasteurized milk. It's non-industrial, but almost the industry has gone so far that in itself is quite a challenging position to take, because that raw milk may well not be safe, because the system that's produced it wasn't set up to make safe raw milk. So
Interestingly, so this football player Erling Haaland,
yes,
who is one of the most currently the most prolific striker in the world, said the other day that his diet is raw milk. And everybody is like, oh, so this is the secret to scoring goals. This is it's interesting, and people are almost like, he consumes raw milk. But you're right, there are still dangers, if you think about milk as being alive.
But what's fascinating is you see how quickly that milk is ascribed a good quality.
Yes,
because milk is such an easy substance for it to suddenly become, this must be a good thing because
of this, exactly. I remember even when I was a student in North America many years ago, and the dairy board there came up with the Dairy Council, I think is what it's called in the US, came up with ads, and they had all these celebrities pushing milk and saying, I think the tagline was milk, it does a body good or something. And they had a variety of
and the milk mustache.
A lot of
got milk. Whoopi Goldberg
got
was a
milk.
big
It was a huge thing, and it comes and and the moral quality also becomes we've talked about regulation, but also the state. So in Kenya, the free milk programs in schools. In the UK, very much the same thing. So that Margaret Thatcher, when that was stopped, you end up with these Margaret Thatcher milk snatcher, and these are highly evocative questions about how whether what the state is providing, what is seen as care.
The interesting thing about Margaret Thatcher didn't actually stop free school milk. It was the threat that she would.
And
that became so charged.
Yes, you're right. It wasn't. She
No,
didn't
but it's
actually
just
do it.
interesting
Yes,
that it's.
but it got remembered as her stopping it. Exactly.
And we had our free Nyayo milk.
Milk,
And there's a whole group or generation that relate to that,
Very
getting the
much so.
milk. Yeah,
Very much so. In
yeah,
Kenya and in the UK,
and in
you
the
can you
UK
can you
as
can
well.
you
Yeah,
can tell which generation somebody's
yes,
from the stories they tell about whether or not they had free school milk.
yeah.
Yeah.
So how do the traditional fermented milk cultures,
Mm.
maziwa mala,
Mm.
silk, even buttermilk, yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah, how do they fit into this Kenya's modern milk imagination?
I mean, as I said, similarly to like Bahaland,
Yeah.
the runners,
Yeah.
many runners will say that is why they run as well as they
Yeah.
do, is because of
Yeah.
more sick. So it's
Yeah.
it is a ancestral thing that has been going for centuries. It's also it's very much a cultural thing. Different, again, coming back to your point about what the cow consumes.
Yeah.
So when the morsik is being fermented, different types of trees are used.
And grass used.
Exactly,
Yeah.
in order to, and these are healthy. They have
Yes.
very good nutritional qualities, these milks, and you and people. But the cultural piece is also very interesting. I remember talking to a woman who was saying that she could not separate the fermented milk that her grandmother used to make from the story. So every evening, her grandmother would tell them stories about how you go about in life, because they were young women, how to behave as women in society as she was making this milk, and then they would drink it before they went to bed.
Okay.
So there is the nutrition, but there's the care, there's the instruction. It's very hard to separate it out from just the substance itself.
Okay, maziwa mala, we see it branded,
Yes.
packaged, yeah,
Yeah.
buttermilk too, but mursik,
Yeah, that's a
it's
very
interesting,
yeah,
from
it is
a commercial perspective, because it has,
yes.
we always see athletes when they come from winning the
Yes.
runners, especially drinking from the gourd, and we all have this thing.
Yeah,
I was just curious. The packaged packaged fermented milk products, is that made with pasteurized milk?
I want to believe so, but I do
yes,
not know.
yeah,
Yeah.
it is.
It
So
is.
it's so I think this is where there's the overlap between culture. And so it's one thing to package maziwa mala, which is something that I think has had a very long association with the quote unquote formal milk industry.
Yes.
But it's another thing to say that you are going to try and take mursik and package it, because who's going to drink that? It is tied up very much with familial, it is actually, speaking of the trust, it is very much about the relationships, because milk is a relational substance. So the kind of milk that you will drink from the supermarket is not the same kind of milk that you would think about drinking when it comes to a continuation of a cultural identity that is linked to that milk.
It was reminding me of something that I was reading an archive from the World Dairy Congress that had these big dairy conferences in the 50s and the 60s, and Kenya was very well represented in those. And they were talking about, how do we get Kenyans consuming fermented milk that's made with pasteurized milk. And the way that they decided to do it was to inject lots of flavoring and sugar. So they created all these flavored yogurts, chocolate, strawberry, and they were like, "Oh, people like fizzy drinks, so what we got to do?" And just the kind of, I don't know the logics that lead you there, that say, the problem here is that people aren't consuming the right kind of milk. So the way that we're going to make sure that they consume the right kind of milk is by stuffing it full of sugar and additives and flavorings, because then they'll have it. And it's an insanity, really.
Yeah, well, that's the power of economic and
It is.
business is how it drives things, right?
Yeah.
Good.
But it was tied up with the morality.
That's
so it
the
was
thing.
the business,
Yeah.
but it's tied up
Tied up
with
with
the aid, and it's tied up with the morality.
Yes,
That,
Yes.
they need to be
it's
drinking the
loaded. It
right
doesn't just
kind.
Yes.
It's
exactly.
very
Exactly.
loaded.
That's very right. Yeah. So if you could, now this is, we're almost coming to the end of this episode, but a couple of questions that I'd like to ask. Yeah, if you could redesign Kenya's dairy future, there you go. So we're going to make sure that the right people hear this. Historically grounded, culturally aware, and ecologically sound. What would it look like, JC? Let's start with you.
I would, for me, it would have to be plural. It would have to be a plural system, meaning that similar to what we have now,
Yes.
so that there's different types of milks that exist, that coexist, because I think it would be about the strengths and matching the appropriateness of that particular milk to that particular context. Because I think what happens, and we already have examples of this in Kenya in terms of the legal system. We have a legal system that allows for plurality. So if we can do that with laws, there's no reason why we couldn't do that with regulations. So just as Johanna was saying, where you have an imaginary of a system that doesn't suit the reality on the ground, the future would be regulation and systems that support what is happening on the ground so that people can consume milk safely. But it doesn't mean that somebody who's living in an urban center will be consuming the same kind of milk as in a rural area. It'll be matched to what's appropriate for that context.
So in a way, it kind of incentivizes rather than becomes a barrier and yet another barrier.
Exactly.
Interesting. Johanna, would you like to add to that?
I mean, I wouldn't want to make assumptions about Kenya, but what I can say, thinking about in a kind of broader global context, is there's something about making space for heritage. And dairy is an industry that's interesting because milk drinking has such a deep cultural heritage in the way that we relate to milk, how we procure it, how we process it. We started this journey working in a museum, and one of the things that fascinated me with the milk collections, we had cheese molds, we had gourds for fermentation, and the industry tries to hide that heritage.
Yes.
The heritage is something, because the heritage is all about responding to the aliveness of the milk.
Yes.
It's all about an industry. It's all about an economy that deals with something that shifts, that moves in the udder as a product. And how do you not control that, but work with it and alongside it. But the way that the dairy industry is about, okay, actually, this is something that we need to squash, we need to control, and the heritage sits in tension with it. So I would like to see much greater understanding of the way that actually traditional producers and processors of milk work with and alongside milk's inherent properties of aliveness, movability, and all of these things, and have more space for that.
Wow, this has been a learning for me. I'll be very cautious when I order milk or consume it going forward. But one last question to both of you. This is really interesting. But I would like to know, I'll start with you, Johanna. What is one thing you wish producers, consumers, and policymakers? What is the one thing you wish that they knew about milk?
I think it's something about recognizing that milk means a lot to people. One thing that we found with this project is everybody has a story to tell about milk, and milk is full of nostalgia. And I feel that when we drink it, we don't recognize where it comes from. We don't recognize the storytelling that accompanies it. We don't see or appreciate the heritage that underpins it. So for me, I wish that we could consume milk not as something that comes out of a tap or something that you open in a fridge that is disposable, but something really quite precious for a number of different reasons.
Okay. I've taken note at a personal level. How about you, JC?
And I'll build on that. The way that milk has shaped our world. When we think about all of the technologies that have come out of us engaging with milk, all of the different gourds, all of the different milk vessels, all of the different things, even the typical kind of aluminium milk churn that is very much the same in many different places. The City of London, there's still places where you can go and see architectural designs on buildings that were responding to the fact that cows were living there. There's a place in London called Chiswick that comes from Cheesewick. It was an area where cheese was made. So I'd like people to remember that actually just as much as we have been shaped by milk, also what it has done to the way that we live and engage with each other. Because in our kind of very fast and busy lives, we forget that engaging with certain substances in particular ways has shaped who we have become as people and how we live in the world.
Well, thank you very, very much. I have learned that I'll take milk very seriously, where
Yes.
it comes from, and yeah, I'll just not order milk. Eh? When I,
Please.
whenever I order tea or hot chocolate, I'll say no, no. Before they put in that milk, let's take a little
I think
pause
I
to
do.
think about it. Yeah, but thank you very much.
Thank
I have
you.
a disclosure to make
Mm.
to our viewers that Dr. JC Niala is my sister.
Yes.
And I'm trying to remember, did we? I hope we treated that cow well.
We did. We treated
Okay.
it. We treated the cow very well.
Yes.
Yeah,
But
no, she had a really good life.
she did it.
She did.
Good, good,
Yeah.
good. So I'd like to
Yeah.
thank you very much, Dr. JC Niala, and to you, Dr. Johanna
Thank you very much.
Zetterstrom,
It's
for
been a
this
pleasure.
very illuminating episode about milk, its importance, the history, and all the power play and things about it.
Yeah. No,
I
thank you for
will
having us.
definitely
Thank you.
not look at milk the same way again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So there you have it, viewers. We've just had a very illuminating and interesting episode on this on milk on this podcast about the accidental farmer, where we bring you the real dirt on farming. Please tune in again for the next episode of the Accidental Farmer podcast.